White as snow as we think about this time of the year, as we think about the past week and all the snow that we've had. Before I get started, I just wanted to, I thought about inviting this guy next week, being the Chiefs are playing in the Super Bowl, but one of my former students has become a star this week. Mr. Daniel Michael from Winston wrote a song about the Chiefs based upon the Johnny Cash's song, Folsom Prison Blues. That's right. Yes, I couldn't think which one it actually was. But so I kind of commented, I said, Daniel, when you become famous, don't forget who your favorite teacher was. And so anyway, he actually made Channel 4 News. He made KFKF. They actually played the song on the radio. And so I think he maybe done another song this week, hasn't he? And I think Brother David, even, they're twins, by the way, Daniel and David. I had them 4 years in school until I could tell them apart. And anyway, they're great kids, and I had a lot of fun with them. And but anyway, if you get a chance, look at Daniel's song or David's song as far as that goes about the Chiefs. So anyway, white as snow. As we think about this scenario here, as we think about the transfiguration of Jesus Christ, we're going to look at that story today and just kind of try to, what is it saying to us? What does it say to us even today? But if you think about that word transfigured or transfiguration, the Greek word that goes with transfigured or transfiguration is actually metamorpho. And some of you, if you remember from science and biology, there's a term called metamorphosis that actually some animals go through, especially insects. But what it means is to transform literally or figuratively, to change. The word is a verb that means to change into another form. And we think about the woolly worm becoming the caterpillar, and it goes through that metamorphic process. There's actually incomplete metamorphosis and complete metamorphosis as you look at those. But it means to change the outside to match the inside. And I want us to really think about that as we go through this lesson today, or this message today. To change the outside to match the inside. In the case of the transfiguration of Jesus Christ, it means to match the outside with the reality of the inside. In other words, to change the outward so it matches the inward reality. In other words, Jesus' divine nature was veiled in human form, and the transfiguration, as it talks about in Hebrews chapter 10, was a glimpse of that glory. So the transfiguration of Jesus displayed this Shekinah glory of God incarnate in the Son. The voice of God attesting to the truth of Jesus' sonship. This was the second time, as we think about the transfiguration, the second time that God's voice was heard, actually. The first time was at Jesus' baptism into his public ministry by John the Baptist. So 2 times we hear God's voice. First with the baptism of Jesus, and then second of all with the transfiguration, which we're going to look at today. In Mark chapter 9, it says this: Now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up on a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His clothes became shiny, exceedingly white, like snow, such as no launderer on earth can whiten them. So white. There's no way that anyone could get anything that white as we see Jesus. Some of you probably have experienced this week. We haven't had too much sunshine, but when that sun comes out with this snow on, it is blinding. And even just with the clouds, there were certain days that It just hurt your eyes almost, or it did hurt your eyes when you were outside with the brightness and the whiteness that the snow makes the earth appear. Well, as we look at these first few verses here, we have three characters, three guys, besides Jesus: Peter, James, and John. Why did he take those three? Why those three as he went up on this mountain? And I'm sure Jesus knew what was going to transpire, what was going to take place. Some would say maybe that they were his favorites, and they were his favorites. There's no doubt about that. And so that may be why he took those three. Another side view could be that they were the ones most likely to get in trouble. So he kept them close to them, or close to him, so you keep an eye on them. We don't know for sure. But why he chose those three? Well, it all started as a great mountain retreat. They were going up on this mountain with Jesus, their master, their Messiah. But things quickly changed. And the reason things quickly changed is because the glory of Jesus came forth on this mountain. See, Jesus was transformed right before the eyes of these three disciples. Matthew says that Jesus' face shone like the sun in Matthew 17, verse 2. We were driving to St. Joe last night, there late in the afternoon, about 3 o'clock, and as we were getting on 6th Highway approaching St. Joe, the sun was trying to peek through. And as I was driving, I was just kind of watching it, and it would get dim, and then all of a sudden it would get brighter, and then it would get dim again, and then it would get brighter. It never did really peek through completely, but you could tell the difference in the brightness. So Matthew says its face shone like the sun. Both Matthew and Mark use the same word, transfigured, to describe what happened to Jesus here on this mountain. And for this brief time on this mountain, Jesus took on the appearance for the King of Glory, rather than the humble man that he was on earth. Mark did his best to describe what Jesus looked like in these verses. And of course, no doubt, it was through the eyes of Peter that Mark is describing this. Because if you think about it, most of Mark's information came from Peter as he wrote his gospel. But basically, Jesus' whole appearance is shown forth in glorious, bright light. It says his clothes became shining and whiter than anything seen on earth. See, as we think about the transfiguration, if we're not careful, we think of the transfiguration as just a bright light shine on Jesus. But this wasn't the type of light. It was a light coming on Jesus. It wasn't a light coming on Jesus from the outside. The word transfigured, as we talked about, means a change on the outside that comes from the inside. It's the opposite of a masquerade, like a masquerade party or a masquerade ball. If you're going to go to a masquerade party, you dress up. You have a mask, so people may not know who you are. So this transfiguration was the opposite of that. That's an outward change. That masquerade, that mask you put on does not come from the inside. It's on the outside. You see, the other thing about this transfiguration, it wasn't a new miracle, let's say. And the reason I say that is this. It was only a temporary pause in an ongoing miracle that was occurring in the life of Jesus. See, the real miracle, I believe, was that Jesus, most of the time, could keep from displaying His glory. Think about that. This is God. This is God in human form. But yet He was able to keep that magnificent glory from shining through the majority of His life. And there was a purpose, I believe, to that. Charles Spurgeon says this: "For Christ to be glorious was almost a less matter than for Him to retain or hide His glory. It is forever His glory that He concealed His glory, and that though He was rich, for our sake He became poor." See, Jesus did this because He had just told His disciples prior to going up on the mountain that He was going the way of the cross in Mark chapter 8. And that spiritually they would follow Him in the way of the cross. Also there in Mark 8. It was easy for them to lose confidence in Jesus at this time, more than likely, because of the negative connotation that was going to happen. Because of the cross. Jesus talked about going by the way of the cross. And I'm sure that's not probably what the disciples really wanted. As Jesus talked about this death, He talked about His death in the future and the way of the cross. But you see now, as these three there are with Jesus on this mountain, He displays His glory as King over all of God's kingdom. The disciples knew that Jesus knew what He was doing. If He was to suffer, if He was to be rejected, if He was to be killed, then through this transfiguration, I think they realized that He was still in control. And folks, that's what we have to remember. I was sharing with the Bible study class this morning. If you get a chance, and I'm kind of promoting it. Andy Stanley has a series right now of, I think it's 3 or 4 sermons. And it's called Talking Points. And it's on the whole political situation that's going on in America today. And he does a really good job of just basically staying in the middle of the road and just sharing his heart about what's going on and how we as followers should deal with the political ramifications that are happening today in our society. But it's called Talking Points. Today will be his 3rd message on this particular story. But as we think about it, the one thing that he says, and I think it's his first message, he talks about being afraid, being fearful of who gets elected or this or that. And he says, why should we fear? If we truly believe and know who's in control, then why should we fear? As followers, as Christians in America today. See, Jesus shows that cross bearers would be glory receivers in this transfiguration. See, the goal isn't the cross. The cross is the path to the goal. And the goal is the glory of God. So as Jesus talked about this cross, He talked about dying on this cross. We've got to remember that that was part of the path to reach that event that occurred 3 days later. And that's the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So the goal isn't the cross. The cross is the path to the goal. And the goal is the glory of God. Verse 4. And Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Okay, you got these 3 disciples. And all of a sudden, we have Elijah and Moses there with Jesus. Talking with Jesus. Why was Moses there? Why was Elijah there? See, both Elijah and Moses represent those who are caught up to God. Jude 1, verse 9 says this: the archangel Michael, who went to the mat with the devil as they fought over the body of Moses, wouldn't have dared level him with a blasphemous curse, but said simply, "No, you don't. God will take care of you." 2 Kings, and it so happened they were walking along and talking, and suddenly a chariot and horses of fire came between them and Elijah. And Elijah went up in a whirlwind to heaven. Elisha saw it all and shouted, my father, you, the chariot, and the cavalry of Israel." See, Moses represents those who die and go to glory. As we think about this transfiguration, as we think about Jesus and Moses and Elijah, Elijah represents those who are caught up in heaven without death. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And regarding the question, friends, that has come up about what happens to those already dead and buried, we don't want you in the dark any longer. First off, you must not carry on over them like people who have nothing to look forward to, as if the grave were the last word. Since Jesus died and broke loose from the grave, God will most certainly bring back to life those who died in Jesus. Elijah, in a sense, kind of represents the rapture that could happen, to where if we're here when the rapture happens, we don't die. We just go, as did Elijah. But if we die before Jesus comes, and we're believers, then we're like Moses, and we'll be in glory with Jesus. Moses also represents the law, and Elijah represents the prophets, as we think about the Old Testament. The sum of the Old Testament revelation. Think about this. The sum of the Old Testament revelation, Moses and Elijah, comes to meet with Jesus at the mountain or Mount of Transfiguration. What a beautiful combining of the old and the new as we think about that transfiguration. They also figure in the future fulfillment of prophecy. Elijah and Moses are likely connected to the witnesses of Revelation in chapter 11. Right in front of them, the disciples saw evidence of life beyond this life. When they saw Moses and Elijah, they knew that Moses had passed from this world a long time ago, almost 1,400 years before. And Elijah had passed some 900 years before. Yet there they were. There they are, right in front of us, right in front of these guys, alive in glory before them. See, I believe that gives those three confidence in Jesus' claim to the resurrection. See, it seems that the disciples just knew that this was Elijah and Moses. And this shows us, think about this. They recognized Elijah, they recognized Moses. So will we recognize loved ones when we get to heaven? I say yes, we will. Just as these three did. They recognized Elijah, they recognized Moses. So we will be recognizable in some way, some form. We won't know less in heaven than we do on earth. Elijah and Moses were interested in the outworking of God's plan through Jesus. And they spoke about what Jesus was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. There in Luke chapter 9, verse 31. Well then, kind of takes a turn. Peter answered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. And let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Because he did not know what to say, for they were greatly afraid. And a cloud came and overshadowed them. And a voice came out of this cloud saying, This is my beloved Son, hear him. Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one anymore, but only Jesus with themselves. Now as they came down from the mountain, he commanded them that they should tell no one the things they had seen till the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept this word to themselves, questioning what the rising from the dead meant. When Peter saw Jesus in all of his glory, he must have said, wow, this is great. This is good. This is how it should be. I can imagine, and I'm not putting words in Peter's mouth, but as we think about Peter, as we think about ourselves and him being a human, let's forget about all this suffering stuff, Jesus. Let's forget about all this being rejected stuff. Let's forget about all this being crucified stuff. Man, let's build some tabernacles so that we can live this way with the glorified Jesus all the time. See, we often get into trouble when we speak like Peter did. Maybe not knowing what to say. We also see that Peter spoke out of fear. It says, for they were greatly afraid. And folks, in fear, sometimes we say things without thinking, and we say some foolish things. See, Charles Spurgeon says, Peter was open-hearted, bold, enthusiastic. To my mind, there is something very lovable about Peter. In my opinion, we need more Peters in the church of the present day. Though they are rash, though they are impulsive, yet there is fire in them. And there is steam in them. So that they keep us going. Luke tells us that Peter, James, and John were all asleep. And when they awoke, they saw Jesus transfigured with Elijah and Moses. It seems like the disciples had a thing about sleep. How many times in the stories are they asleep? They were human, just like us. We were watching a show last night. I fell asleep. So I'm going to have to go back and watch the end of it because I didn't see the end of it. And that was 8:20. So I went to bed at 8:30. And then got up at 4 o'clock this morning. Anyway, back to point. Luke tells us that Peter, James, and John were asleep. What Peter said was foolish because he's putting Jesus on equal level with Moses and Elijah. One tabernacle for each. But Jesus isn't just another Moses. He's not just another Elijah. He's greater than Moses or Elijah. See, Jesus is the Son of God. So being in the presence of God's glory isn't necessarily a pleasant experience maybe at all times. Especially when we're like Peter, not really glorifying God. But sometimes the glory of God is shown in a way that He corrects us. It's interesting, the cloud. When it talks about the cloud appeared and the voice came out of the cloud. How many times do we hear about the cloud? In Exodus, we have the cloud that stood by Israel in the wilderness. It was the cloud of glory that God spoke to Israel from Exodus chapter 16. It was from this cloud of glory that God met with Moses and others. It was with the cloud of glory that stood by the door of the tabernacle. It was from this cloud that God appeared to the high priest in the holy place inside the veil. It was from this cloud God appeared to Solomon when the temple was dedicated, so filling the temple that the priest could not continue. It was the cloud of Ezekiel's vision filling the temple of God with the brightness of His glory. It was the cloud of glory that overshadowed Mary when she conceived Jesus by the power of the Holy Spirit in Luke. It was the cloud of glory that received Jesus into heaven at his ascension. It was the cloud that will display the glory of Christ when he returns in triumph of this earth in Luke chapter 21. The voice from the cloud of glory made it clear that Jesus was not on the same level of Moses and Elijah. It says, he, the beloved Son. So, hear him. Listen to him. Hear what he says. This word from heaven answered the disciples' doubts after the revelation of the suffering Messiah. It assured them that the plan was all right with God the Father. After it was all over, Peter, James, and John, says that the Scripture tells us they kept the word to themselves. After all, who would believe them? Think about that. Who would believe them if they told that story? But the event left a very lasting impression on these men. Matter of fact, in 2 Peter chapter 1, Peter says, this is how the voice from God saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear him," still rang in his ears, confirming who Jesus was. But you know, as impressive as this experience was to those three, and no doubt it had an effect on their lives. Think about this. Seeing that transfiguration, how great that was. But folks, that would not impact their lives as much as being born again would. Becoming a believer, becoming a follower of Jesus. You see, being born again by the Spirit of God is the great miracle. The lives of the disciples, the great display of the glory of God forever. Charles Spurgeon once again says, "It is a better thing for a man to live near to Christ and to enjoy his presence than it would be for him to be overshadowed with a bright cloud and to hear the divine Father himself speaking out of it." Be better for that man to live near to Christ and to enjoy his presence. So as we think about all of this, as we think about 2020, and here a couple weeks ago we talked about the 2020 vision. What's the vision for a church? This morning in Bible study we talked about our gifts from Romans chapter 12. The many, many gifts that we have here as a church, as a congregation. And each one of us has a very, very special gift that God has given us. And it's our obligation as what he's done for us that we use those gifts to our fullest ability. But as we go on through this year, as we think about 2020, and what's 2020 have for our church here at Hopewell? What does 2020 have for the whole United States of America as far as the gospel of Jesus Christ? In Mark chapter 9, it says, he asked the boy's father, "How long has this been going on?" Ever since he was a little boy. Many times it pitches him into fire or the river to do away with him. If you can do anything, do it. Have a heart and help us. And Jesus said, if, two-letter word, if, with a question mark, if. Folks, there are no ifs among believers of Jesus Christ. Anything can happen. if the Chiefs win, hey, there's no ifs, right? And no sooner were the words out of his mouth than the Father cried, "Then I believe. Help me with my doubts." Help me with my doubts. As great as it would have been to be amongst those three on that mountain and to see that Shania glory, to see Jesus transfigured, to see his true glory coming forth, coming out of him. Light wasn't shining on him, light was shining from him. But you see, we too can have that opportunity. We too can share that opportunity as the church of Hopewell in 2020. No ifs. If, no ifs. But then as the Father here said, I believe, please help me with my unbeliefs. That's me, I don't know about you. And we have to deal with that every day. There are no ifs this year. See, Jesus didn't call us to be disciples. He called us to make disciples. And that's our mission. That's what we need to do and continue to do. I challenge you, and I know not everybody's here, and I'll probably do this again next week, but this is my challenge for you, and I think I mentioned this maybe a couple weeks ago. Every week of this year, 2020, invite someone to church. And I know you say, well, I can't do it every week. You could. I could. I invited someone last week, and now I can't remember if I invited someone this week. And of course, I understand the weather is probably not the best scenario to invite. But next week's supposed to be nice, in the 40s. So invite. And let's continue to invite. To come and hear the good news of Jesus Christ. Let's love others like Jesus loved us. That great command. Father, we just thank you for this day. We thank you for your love. And we just give you praise. In Jesus' name, amen.